Hello and welcome to What the Tech from Boast AI, where we talk with some of the brilliant minds behind new and exciting shred initiatives to learn what it takes to tackle technological uncertainty and eventually change the world. Today, we've got a full house on the show as I'm joined by Boast AI's own technical solutions manager, Aliya Amershi, who is going to hop on as co-host for an interview with one of Boast's most exciting clients, Natureblocks. Before we dive into that conversation, I'm going to turn the mic over to Aliya to give a quick introduction to the very impressive work she does, both with Boast and as a founder in her own right. So, Aliya, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be on the podcast and to connect with you guys, Natureblocks, again as well. So just a little background about myself. I actually joined Boast in the fall and have a whole portfolio of R&D clients that I work with, and so far have helped them claim over $2.5 million in shred credits. Yes. And then going back a little bit about my background, I did my degree in computer science at UBC. I'm a former software engineer, lead developer, and technical project manager, worked really all over the world in the gaming and entertainment industry, such as Electronic Arts here in Vancouver, Codemasters in England, and then Viacom Networks in New York. The last project I worked on in the corporate space was the Nick app, and we won an Emmy. And then after that, I decided to join the whole entrepreneurship world and decided to bootstrap my own startup. So I actually ended up launching 2 tech startups over the years. And at the same time, I also worked with the Founder Institute and startups.com. And then I was also published in Forbes and Inc. magazine on my advice on technology and entrepreneurship. And then my current business, which is Code-Free App Launch, is where I help early stage entrepreneurs launch their innovative app ideas using no-code solutions, as well as getting customers using also AI tools. Turned it into pretty much passive income generator and looking to kind of get into the next thing later on, perhaps.
That sounds like a lucrative passive income generator. Very happy to hear that, Aliya. Thank you so much. And now for our guests this week, we have founder and CEO James Davidson, as well as CFO Harrison White, on to talk about Natureblocks, the first blockchain-based carbon offset development platform. Now they're helping everybody from farmers to auditors understand their carbon footprint. I'll leave it to James and Harrison to get into the nitty-gritty about their solution. And without further ado, welcome to the show, James and Harrison.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us. Great to be here.
Yeah, we're excited.
Awesome. All right. So before we dive into the business of it all, I'd love to learn some more about your background and why you got into the work that you do today and what motivated you to become the entrepreneurs that we have before us. James, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. I am a computer scientist by trade, and I've been in the startup space for about 5 years now. And, as I kind of got to learn what that space entails, I realized that most of it was making mistakes and trying over and over again. And I eventually kind of had this thought that, that's something that I could do too. How I ended up starting Natureblocks was a bit of an interesting story. A few years ago, we had a bunch of forest fires, and I kind of had this crazy dream where I imagined my grandma's house burning down. And I kind of...
I don't mean to laugh at that. That's just abrupt. Wasn't ready for that.
But it's true. It is kind of the origin story in some sense. And I kind of woke up from that dream and knew that I wanted to spend my life focusing on climate change. And I had some rough ideas about how I could do that with the skill sets that I had. I certainly didn't think that I'd be where I am today, building the product that I am today. But that was a part of the whole learning experience. That's my background, and that's kind of why I'm here.
I mean, James, that certainly resonates. I know the fires right now in Canada, it's very real, that dream scenario you had. So I'm glad you're on the case today. But yeah, Harrison, I guess, what's your background? How did you come to Natureblocks and what drives you?
Yeah, so it's a pretty different journey than with James. So for me, I think I was born to be an accountant. Not really.
Sorry to laugh.
Nobody was born to be an accountant. I think I took the path that most people took into accounting, and where I didn't know what I wanted to do. And I saw so many businesses needed accountants. They had to deal with their numbers, right? So I went through and I did university. I did my CPA, went through all the steps. I was working at an accounting firm. But I felt like I wanted to do something on my own. Like I had that little entrepreneurial part of me. So I decided to create my own fractional CFO service. So I was working with the various companies, helping them achieve their goals, mostly startups. And that was really cool. I got to see what it was like working with startups, but I didn't feel like it was part of what I was doing. I was kind of just helping them out. I wasn't really involved in making something come to life. And then I met James and also Ryan, two of the founders of Natureblocks. And I got really excited about what they were working on, what they're building towards. And it kind of pulled me away from my own thing to be able to help build Natureblocks. And I'm glad I have.
That is awesome. Yeah. I mean, I personally, numbers scare me. So accounting is something I have avoided most of my life. It's very funny that I now work at Boast where we work with numbers all day. But I feel very similarly that you did coming to Boast in that I'm putting my time into something that's very meaningful and that I'm actually having a hand in building. So I think that's something that I hear a lot when we have these conversations with founders and co-founders. There's simpatico in what we do at Boast and the kind of DNA of the startups we're helping. So going into kind of the business of it all, tell us a little bit more, I guess, about Natureblocks. We got the Genesis story, or at least the roots of the Genesis story, but I guess, James Harrison, what actually was the step-by-step? All right, I woke up, I decided blockchain for carbon emissions. How did that come to be?
Oh man, quite a process.
I can kind of tell you where the idea kind of how it evolved through those early stages, and then I can pass it off to Harrison. Initially, I've always been fascinated by technology, and I've always been the kind of person that really gets into the weeds. So when blockchain technology came out, AI technology came out, I went out and I started researching it, and not just high level. I started reading all these very technical specifications and protocols, and tried programming it out myself. And I started looking into how some of the coins worked, and some of them were pyramid schemes, these cryptocurrencies that people were creating. And it was really sad that people were pulling the rug, but there were some genuinely good ideas in there that the people had that I kind of thought, well, why don't we do this? And one of those general ideas was this principle that you could back a currency by something that isn't just issued out by the government. It could be backed by, an idea or a principle or a set of values. And that's kind of what a lot of these tokens were about. They were like, oh, this is, whatever algae token, or this is tree token, or this is indigenous token, or whatever it was. And the idea was that the more you use that token, the more you bought into the set of principles and values that that token represented. And I started spitballing. I said, okay, well, right now, what I felt like the biggest problem with climate change was really not so much anything other than an economics problem. I thought, climate change really needs better funding, it needs better policy, it needs a whole host of, regulations or financial incentives to come into place to really accelerate innovation and decarbonization. And I started spitballing this idea of, okay, well, why don't we try building a token that, effectively rewards people for taking sort of climate initiative? And what we ended up designing initially was not what we're building at all today, but it was essentially this idea that you could do something good for the planet, get rewarded with a token, and then sell it. And as we kind of got more into that and started kind of building out our own token, so to speak, we realized that this principle already exists, and it's called a carbon offset. And that journey through that, led us to kind of research what the status quo of carbon offsets were, and who's buying them and why are they buying them. And that kind of illustrated a whole host of issues on both sides of the market. It's complicated to figure out what your carbon footprint is. And people that are generating offsets, most of them are on PDFs, so they're not digital, or they look like they were created 30 years ago. And quite frankly, there's a lot of fraud going on with it. And it didn't seem like to me that this was really a complicated problem. It felt like it was just a matter of bookkeeping. Someone should just automate this whole thing and make it really simple and easy to use and follow through the process. And I figured, well, the heck, that's what technology is all about. That's something that we know how to do. And that kind of led us to starting our fundraise. And that was about a year ago, and about the time that Harrison had joined and many, many others. So with that out of the way, I'll pass it over to you, Harrison. How has it been from your perspective watching the company evolve?
Yeah, it's pretty cool. It's interesting seeing how much things can change, and you don't necessarily need to have everything sorted out at the beginning of a startup. You don't need to know exactly what you're going to do and exactly how every individual component is going to work. But if you have people that are dedicated towards solving the big problems, you can find ways to create innovative solutions. So even just from when I started to where things are at now, it's pretty crazy seeing how much things have changed and a lot of the new things that kind of we've came up with. I guess I should kind of give an overview of what the platform is like right now, because maybe people have heard a lot about carbon and offsets and stuff, but they might not know exactly how things connect together. Normally, the way that I would start explaining that is I usually ask if people understand what the idea of being carbon neutral. So what about the two of you? Do you know what it means to be carbon neutral or how a business could get there?
I think from my understanding is to use the word offset again, that you're not producing more than you're offsetting, at least in terms of the carbon footprint that you have. My very layman's understanding, and admittedly using words you might have put in my mouth, but that's how I
Yeah, that's pretty good. All right, I guess we could hear Aliya's. I feel like Aliya knows too much.
Right. Yeah, I got the insider info.
Got the secrets.
Right.
Yeah. Well, so the reason I was asking about that is because most people don't know what it really means to be carbon neutral. They have a general idea, like I think Paul gave at the beginning, but they don't know how a business got there to begin with. And most business owners don't know how to get there either. And when they try to figure it out, it's very complicated. It's most of the tools out there require so much data and so much manual input and effort that most businesses can't become carbon neutral, which we think is a problem. So part of our solution to that is we try to find the easiest way to help these businesses become carbon neutral. And the first step to get there is you first have to calculate what your carbon emissions are, which is hard enough in its own. So the way that we're doing that is we allow companies to connect their bank accounts, upload any receipts or invoices that they have. And our software uses AI, and that's a buzz term, but it analyzes everything and calculates what the carbon emissions are for all the different things that they've purchased. And so that's one super quick way to be able to determine what their actual footprint is, what their effect on the planet is. And then after that point, businesses can try to reduce those emissions. So we're building out the components to help them find ways to emit less. And then the last part of it, which is also a big part, is most businesses can't get all the way to carbon neutral because you still need to buy things. If you're a coffee shop, you still need to buy something, and there's going to be carbon emissions from that. So in order to get to carbon neutral, most businesses have to buy what are called offsets. And those are different projects where people do something in the world that helps bring carbon emissions out of the air. That's kind of the simplest way to put it. So, for example, if there's barren land that someone owns, and instead of building some building on it or something, they want to plant trees and help pull carbon emissions out of the air, they can get carbon credits that become offsets for those businesses. So there's quite a lot of components, but that all together helps allow businesses to become carbon neutral. And we're building both sides of it. So we have the footprint accounting side, which is the kind of automated connect your bank account side. And the other side of it is helping to develop these projects, which is really a difficult process right now for, say, this person who wants to start planting seeds on their land. And we're making that much easier, much more transparent, and we're recording everything onto the blockchain or a blockchain. That's my summary.
It's so interesting. I was just going to say, I've heard carbon emissions, I've heard offsets, I've heard blockchain. Very rarely in the same conversation, at least for that latter point, and especially using blockchain almost as a source of record, as a way to really kind of just track it all and make sure it all comes together. Anything beyond like for funds. So that's extremely interesting.
I love this, and I'd love to kind of go back to, the whole footprint accounting challenge and your solution. So I think to really help explain it to our audience a little bit further, maybe kind of talk through the example of how to find the carbon footprint of a cup of coffee and like the 3 levels of scope, you've talked about, and going upstream, downstream, all of that. I think would be really great to kind of paint the picture with that specific example.
Yeah, for sure. And I'll touch down on this one a bit. When you first hear about scope and you get it explained to you, it can seem really, really complicated. But it's actually quite simple. The example that I always use is if one of you owned a generator and you put a bunch of gasoline in it and you burned that gasoline to generate power, that would be your scope 1 emission. If you sold the electricity that you generated from that generator to someone else, the person who bought it, that is their scope 2 emission, right? So you're 1 removed. If you then use that electricity to create a product or, run a service and then you sell that service to someone else, that is that person's scope 3 emission. So the further away you are from direct emissions, the kind of less responsible you are for it. Now, people and large businesses are calculating their scope 1, their scope 2, and their scope 3 emissions, sometimes scope 3, but sometimes they just limit it to scope 1 and scope 2. And that's when they make their claims that they're becoming carbon neutral. The reason a lot of large businesses like Microsoft aren't claiming scope 3 is because you would literally need to calculate, like, your phone case, your t-shirt, what you bought in the morning, every single pen in your office, all of the paper. It's an exercise in futility, quite frankly. So when you look at this holistically, this massive picture of these scopes, scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3, what you realize is that if every business was carbon neutral at the scope 1 level, that we would actually have carbon neutrality across the entire planet. And that's a pretty key distinction to note, because right now, most businesses are achieving carbon neutrality at scope 1 and scope 2, which actually means that if everyone did that, then we'd actually be carbon negative. But there's a reason for that. And the reason for that is because some places of the world, like for example, BC Hydro, if they're, a lot of it comes from, dams and hydropower, which is quite clean, but not all of it is. Sometimes we burn natural gas, we burn oil to compensate for the extra load on the grid, at like peak hours when we don't have enough hydropower to meet demand. And when that happens, if BC Hydro was to offset their scope 1 emissions, remember that electricity when we buy it is scope 2. If they were to offset their emissions, they would have to put a massive surcharge on electricity to every one of the residents in Canada, anyone's buying their electricity. So the reason we have the scope 1, 2, and 3, and the reason people are making claims that they're offsetting both scope 1 and scope 2 is because if everyone offsets scope 1, our entire economic system would be upended overnight. So it's going to be more of this gradual system where people are overcompensating for their own emissions until regulations come in place, until we have massive infrastructure rebuilds where our electricity is clean at the source. So our system effectively is designed to help you track down your scope 1, your scope 2, and your scope 3 emissions.
No, that's great. I love how you explained that. So yeah, if you could walk us through then, business is using your platform, if they say upload their receipts or maybe a financial statement or document. Can you walk us through how you kind of traverse all of those inputs and then, determine what their carbon footprint is?
Sure.
You want to tackle that one, Harrison?
My turn?
Yeah.
So usually the first step for a business would be they would connect their accounts. So you've got your bank accounts, your credit card accounts and all that. And you can get essentially all the information about what a business does from how they spend their money. So all of that information, once it's connected, gets pulled into our system, our footprinting software. It does go through each item. So say for a bank statement, it'll go through each individual purchase and categorize it into a specific code. And that code has a attached emission factor. So that it can calculate from there what emissions are from, say, purchasing something from Foot Locker, something like that, right? And then the next step is that if a company wants to be more accurate, because for some purchases, you might say you buy something from Walmart, there could be so many different things. Walmart sells like a crazy amount of different items. So if we have a system where you can upload your receipts and it'll analyze each individual receipt line item. So you'll be able to see that they purchased bananas and they also purchased milk, and it'll get the specific emission factor for that item. So that's the general process for them being able to calculate their emissions to begin with. It can get a lot more complicated than that if you wanted to. Like you could calculate, where the milk came from. You could calculate all these extremely detailed things about what's been purchased. But most businesses can't get to that level of detail. It's just way too much work. So we're finding, I think, the perfect ground where you can get quite accurate, but it's something that any business can do.
No, that's super interesting. And it's actually funny that you had mentioned too, I went to Foot Locker. I'm thinking about how I specifically bought a pair of shoes from a company that was like, we're going to plant 10,000 trees because you bought this one pair of shoes. And I'm like, okay, what does that actually offset in the grand scheme? Like, is there finagling that they can do around that? But just another way to like illustrate how ignorant I am towards what offsets actually mean in this context.
I can give you some rough figures, actually, if you're interested.
For sure.
A single pair of shoes, from what I've seen, puts out about 80 kilograms, 50 to 80 kilograms of CO2, which is pretty wild because a pair of shoes are about half a kilogram. So you got about whatever the weight of your shoes are, multiply that by 100. That's how much is being pumped out into the sky. A single tree can sequester about, depends on the tree and about how old it is, but you can probably assume about 20 kilograms per year. So and those are kind of smaller, younger trees. So you'd have to have 5 trees growing at once. They'd have to be growing for an entire year to offset that one pair of shoes. You can actually see how many trees we will kind of need to solve this problem.
The returns diminish too when it's like we're planting new trees that can't take in that much capture versus an old tree that might have been taken down and we lost that ability to capture carbon.
Paul, I don't think you and I are going to ever look at shoes the same way again after this conversation.
And that's devastating for me. Yes.
Yeah. As soon as you're actually looking at these numbers, you realize the effect that it's having. And it's not just as businesses, but as an individual, you can realize all these things that I'm purchasing, they're contributing to what's happening in the world. That's why I think it's super useful to even just for businesses to see what their impact is, because then they realize, okay, well, if I make these small changes, we can actually have a big effect on what that impact is going to be, and we can not have as much of a negative effect on the world.
Looking at through the lens of that scope, like you were saying, that scope 1, 2, 3, like knowing where the primary source and the most damaging offsets can originate. That's not anything I really ignorantly, again, thought about when I approached the conversation around offsets. I thought it was a lot more cut and dry than that, and that you can really just draw a direct line between a bad actor and a good actor, or their actions and their emissions.
It actually reminds me of something, Paul, that is a really fascinating point, and it's something that always comes up in conversation when I talk to people about it that are just getting into the space. And that is the idea that sometimes like a super large company is worse for the planet. And in many senses, in absolute terms, it can be. But when you look at this term called carbon density, which is effectively the carbon footprint per product that they sell, what we often find sometimes is that larger companies have more optimized logistics and they can actually reduce that. That's not to say that we should be promoting capitalism and selling more and more, but just that when you look at it on a per item basis, sometimes larger companies actually have more optimized footprints.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was just going to add also to the point where Peter Drucker says you can't manage what you can't measure. So I think when people and businesses are seeing those numbers, it changes user behavior. Just like even with a CGM monitor, for instance, you're like managing your blood sugar levels. I think, this is like managing your carbon footprint levels. Is the
exactly. Yeah. And we want to eventually get to a place where all businesses are doing this. And I think like the world's going that direction. Eventually, there'll probably be legislation that says as a business, you have to calculate your carbon footprint. It'll just be like doing your bookkeeping and taxes at the end of the year. So we're trying to help create a platform where we can allow businesses to voluntarily move there before it's going to be a requirement.
Absolutely. Is that the vision you're saying for the future and how you're going to contribute to that future where everybody is required to measure their carbon footprint?
That's one half of the vision. There's the carbon offset side of the project, which is probably a much bigger problem in its own right.
Yes. So let's talk about that piece now. So sequestration accounting. So could you explain that a little bit more? And what was the biggest sort of challenge there that really kept you up at night and trying to solve this piece, and how did you solve it?
For sure. And so just like a little bit of a precursor to anyone that's listening that doesn't fully understand carbon offsets in general, Harrison kind of touched down on it earlier, but the basic principle is that if you can measure some, goodwill against the planet, you can put it in a box and you can kind of sell it. That's effectively what a carbon offset is. And, it turns out that measuring goodwill against the climate is incredibly hard. If you plant an apple tree in your backyard, how much of a difference does that make to the soil versus a pear tree, right? In the grand scheme of things, not much, but these little tiny questions, when you multiply that against, hundreds of thousands of hectares, it can actually make quite a dramatic difference. And you start getting into other, big problems when you're doing like land restoration or replanting. Like, who owns the land? Are there any indigenous claims to the land? Is someone leasing the land? Does this belong to a logging company? Do they want to plant trees that aren't native to the area, that might be invasive? How is this going to affect the wildlife in the area? All these different factors that are incredibly complex. And when you start getting into it, you realize that, wow, holy crimoly, like, you basically need to be an expert on like math, science, biology, statistics, business relations, indigenous history. Like, the list goes on and on and on. Like, it's just such a complicated problem. And what ends up happening, or what has happened historically in the past, is people try to make false claims about the goodwill that they've done. And we hear this term, it's called greenwashing. And people have been historically putting this in a box and selling carbon offsets, which are illegitimate. And an example of this that you'll see it can be quite rampant, is this idea of logging deferral. So the general idea is, if there's a bunch of land and it's slated to be logged, and you kind of say, okay, well, we're not going to log the land because these trees are sucking carbon out of the air, so let's leave the trees up and gain the credits. That can be a legitimate claim for carbon offsets. The problem is, if I owned a bunch of land, I could threaten to cut down my own trees and then rescind that statement just to generate offsets and sell them by literally doing nothing. And there has been enough people doing this historically in the past that now there's a little bit of a narrative that offsets are harmful, or they're fake, or they don't do any good. And that's a problem, because offsets are actually a very viable economic means of giving people money to solve climate change. That's kind of what this whole trade and barter system around offsets is designed to do. So that's kind of a symptom. Underlying that is the problem, which is that the current state of generating carbon offsets is very much a very retroactive process, in the sense that some people will go and plant a bunch of trees, and then after the fact, they'll say, okay, well, we planted all these trees. Where did the carbon come from? And they might kind of change the way they declared their intentions initially, so that it matches a narrative down the line about how things actually panned out. And an example could be, say that someone planted a bunch of trees because they wanted to harvest pears or apples. And then 10 years down the line, or wood or whatever, right? And then 10 years down the line, they find out that the price of carbon is worth more than the wood, or worth more than, harvesting all of these apples and pears. And now they change their narrative and they say, okay, well, actually 10 years ago, our intention was to create carbon offsets in the first place. That's an illegitimate claim, because that was not your intention. You did not go out of your way to go help the planet in this scenario. So one of the big reasons for us putting it on the blockchain is to help people that do have good intentions to say from the beginning, yeah, this is what we're going to do, and this is why we're going to do it. And once it's put on the blockchain, at that point, it's irrefutable down the line that that was not your intention. And this is kind of the big problem with offsets. And this is where a lot of people get really frustrated or really passionate about it when they're really angry about the whole state of this ecosystem, is that there's just so much kind of backdoor deals going on. And it kind of, back to what I was saying earlier, it's a matter of record keeping. If you just lay this information out from the beginning, it becomes so much easier for everyone to be on the same page and get to the solution faster, more honestly, more transparently, and every party benefits. Every party wins in that scenario.
Absolutely. It's establishing accountability. And like you were saying earlier, right now, there isn't necessarily a mandate per se that's forcing businesses to be accountable in this way, or to stay to their word when they make these kinds of promises. Even bringing it back to how you were saying in the future, ideally, there will be a mandate where businesses will have to implement these best practices, but also this kind of system of record, almost like they would for bookkeeping or for taxes at the end of the year. I'm going to slyly try to transition this now into asking you guys a little bit about both the R&D that you've done to create the solution. I think we've alluded to it a little bit, but also about your experience working with Boast. So what we do here is we help make sure that you can maximize your access to non-dilutive funding through both tax credits, government grants, and really just making sure that you're optimizing your R&D function to receive the most that you can at the end of the year. Aliya can totally say that a lot more succinctly than I can. I'd love to know more about just kind of when did R&D tax credits and when did non-dilutive funding in that arena first come on your radar? And then secondarily, when did Boast come on your radar?
Well, one thing about our business is I think it was pretty clear that what we were doing fit pretty well with research and development, because that's what we were doing and all we were doing essentially. We're at the stage where we can now commercialize and start selling this product. Before that, there's so many different things that were involved in order to get to the point we're at now. And I think most people know that there are some credits out there. There's something that you can earn from this work that you've done, but it's not very clear what the credits are, how much you can receive, what you can include when you're making these applications. So it's a pretty overwhelming process to try to deal with something like that yourself. We just knew that we wanted to do it right, and we wanted to be able to make sure that we're claiming as much as we can without, pushing things past the line. So we heard about some really good reviews from Boast, from other people, and just seemed like it would be a pretty good fit for us. So we went forward from there.
No, that's awesome. I know we've had a great time working with you guys too. What had been your experience applying for R&D tax credits, if you had in the past before you worked with Boast?
This is the first time that I've had to submit a claim myself. I've kind of worked on claims a bit in the past, and I know James has as well, probably even more directly than me. But I'd say the hardest thing about it is taking these massive concepts that we have that have so much detail and so many different components to them, and actually getting them down to the summary that CRA expects you to submit to them. Because it's actually not that much in terms of word count needs to be submitted. But in order to fit everything, so much information into a very small, compact, understandable submission, that is a really hard part. And I don't know if we would have been able to do it without the help of Boast. And yeah, so I think that was a pretty key component.
One thing I'd add on as well is, a lot of startups, ours included, are absolutely strapped for time and going through the process of submitting Shred. Like, if we were in dire straits, we would have, done it ourselves. But having Boast in particular kind of take care of all that heavy lifting for us saved us so much time. And that was worth it all day long for us.
Yeah, especially when you're a smaller company too, that's just starting out and every team member is super valuable. I imagine pulling somebody off of a project who's involved in the R&D, it's not the best use of their time to have them heads down working with the finance team to just figure out what qualifies where, especially when you're coming at it with some very, very technical concepts. I'm sure it helps to have a team like ours that can kind of speak that vernacular and can understand pretty quickly, ideally, what you guys are trying to do and how to communicate that to the CRA or to any body that's going to vet your system for potential non-dilutive funding.
Yeah, I think in some ways it probably helped us be able to communicate and consolidate our ideas better too. Just working with Aliya and having to be able to get these ideas down to a very concrete level, I think is probably helpful for us.
Thank you. I know I loved working with you guys as well. I think what made it easier was that you guys were very responsive and you really clearly explain everything really well. So it made my job easier to kind of put together everything in a nice, concise report.
The risk of maybe digging too deep, could you guys give us some insight into what you're going to do with the cash that we helped you get back? Are you going to funnel it into more R&D? Is there a specific project you have in mind that is now going to be able to be actionable because you were able to get some cash back into it? Growing headcount? What's the plan?
Well, for a company like ours, most of our costs are staff, because that's how you power a software company. That's how you make these new developments happen. So obviously the Shred funding and pretty much any other funding we're getting is helping to grow our staff. And that helps us, essentially achieve all the projects we're working on.
I'd say that Shred quite literally is exactly what you get in the name: scientific research and economic development. Like, the money has just gone back into R&D. This tax program, this is my fourth or fifth startup that I've been in since I graduated university, and every single one that I've been in has gone through Shred. So I'm very accustomed to this process. It's been invaluable every single time, time and time and time again. I often say to people that are down in the valley, Like it's easier to fundraise down there once you've got a product that's up and running. But if you're just getting started, like Canada and the grants that we have here are pretty kick-ass. Excuse, my language there. So it's going back into R&D. Like it's going back into payroll, it's going back into staff, it's going back into, and that in turn is building out the product, getting it ready for commercialization, paying for external resources. Like the list goes on and on and on.
That's so cool.
We're super grateful to have received Shred.
That's awesome. And I'm glad we could help. You had mentioned that you'd done it at 4 or 5 other startups previously. Did you work with Boast at any of those other startups, or was this your first time working with our team?
This is my first time working with Boast, and it came at the recommendation of another company, Victoria Originaire. They had good things to say about it, so we followed suit. In the past, I'd used other agencies as well. Boast was pretty solid. You made it easy, so no complaints there.
That's what we want to hear. No, happy to hear it, guys. Aliya, anything you want to ask before we hop off?
No, I think that was great. I really appreciate, all the kind words and that we could help you. I feel like you're working on a really important mission and an important problem that needs to be solved. And you're really, approaching it from a unique way. Like who would have thought you could do like carbon footprint accounting with AI, blockchain, and all of that. But you guys have, put that together and figured it out. So,
every buzzword.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Right. So kudos to you. I love your mission and everything you're doing.
Thanks. That's great to hear.
Yeah, I second that. I really like that this is a solution that it lays out in front of everybody what they need to do to be better actors in this scenario. I'm hoping for a future where this is widely adopted and that it is like bookkeeping at the end of the year. It's just something you've got to do. And again, I can't thank you guys enough for hopping on the show.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, this was great.
And thank you, listeners, for joining us. Please subscribe to What the Tech from Boast AI, wherever you get your podcasts.